The president and the vice president make a campaign stop in Toledo, testimony to where the prime real estate is located in election 2020. A new poll gives us the lay of the land as Michigan voters remain very divided on the president. What will make the difference? Today is Sunday, January 12th, 2020, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. Welcome to Grand Central Station when it comes to this year's election. The Great Lakes region is going to see plenty of traffic from candidates over the next 10 months. Exhibit A, well, how about the fact that President Trump's final campaign stop of 2019 was in Grand Rapids, and his first campaign stop of 2020 was in Toledo Thursday night. And that made the results from our new Local 4 Detroit News poll some very intriguing reading this past week. This morning, we're going to dig into the results as we find, not surprisingly, that the state remains sharply divided. There are reliably red states, there are reliably blue states, and then there are the purples where the election will be decided. Now, to be sure, the president trails several of the Democratic candidates in Michigan, but it's nothing close to a blowout. And we carry with us, of course, the lessons from reading polls in 2016. But we also polled Michiganders on the Gary Peters-John James race for U.S. Senate. And we looked at the job approval picture for Governor Whitmer. So there's plenty to talk about. And in a moment, we'll get the big takeaways from our pollster, Richard Zuba. And then we'll bring in our roundtable to talk about what we expect will tip Election Day one way or the other. Michigan leaders have long talked about wanting our vote to matter. Wish granted. And we'll talk about it today on Flashpoint. Let's start this morning by looking at the key findings in our brand new Local 4 Detroit News poll. Pollster Richard Zuba of the Glenn Gariff Group is in Florida this morning, lucky him, and joins us now via Skype. Richard, off the top, and it's the first thing that you mentioned in your summary in the poll, the motivation to get out and vote, with 10 being the highest, Michigan is at a 9.5, historically engaged the last time around, and it has not abated at all.
Well, it's a remarkable shift from 2016, where we saw just record low motivation to vote. And in 2018, we saw record high, and it has not stopped. Everybody's eager to vote on all sides of the aisle and in the middle. And I think we're going to see a very large turnout heading into the presidential election.
Well, let's start with the president's approval ratings then. They are actually up 3 points from your last poll, which was last summer, but still only about 40% of Michigan voters approve of the job he's doing, compared to 51% who don't approve.
Right. It's a little bit of minor movement. It's within the survey's margin of error from last time also. It's something we'll keep an eye on. Maybe it's improved a little, but not much. And what we've seen is these numbers are just stuck in cement, and they have been, for the better part of 3 years. We're just not seeing a lot of movement in these numbers.
The gender gap here remains glaring. President Trump's base is men, and women are far more likely to dislike him.
Absolutely. In fact, it's a pretty historic gender gap right now. There's some real interesting differences. Southeast Michigan women down in Metro Detroit, just strongly opposed to the president right now. Outstate men strongly, in support of the president. I think one of the interesting things to watch will be Metro Detroit men and how they end up breaking in this race. I think that's where the fight is.
Well, let's look at the fight. All 5 of the leading Democrats that you polled hold an advantage over President Trump. Now, some of them are within the margin of error, but here you see where Richard's findings break down. It is surprising to me, and I think to everybody, when we first saw this come out, the second strongest Democrat right now after Joe Biden is Michael Bloomberg. Were you surprised?
I was surprised. And we went and took a look at why that's happening. And he does better amongst men than all the other candidates. He has a slight advantage over Biden right now amongst men. Biden's advantages are that he really holds down some of Trump's strengths in the rural areas and just wipes up the suburbs. He does tremendously well in suburban areas.
Do you feel any less support for Bernie Sanders, given that he's the guy who won the primary in Michigan the last time around, or is he doing about the same in your view?
No, actually, from June, Bernie Sanders has dropped about 6 points against Donald Trump. It's a very interesting, noticeable difference from the June survey. The one thing I remind people is, half of Democrats in Michigan have voted for Bernie Sanders already. And they've invested something into him, but all of Democrats have voted for Joe Biden. So it makes those two very interesting because people have invested in them already.
Names they've seen on ballots before. Really interesting way of looking at it. I also want to move to the Senate race because you looked into that. The incumbent Gary Peters being challenged by John James. John James was unable to unseat Debbie Stabenow in 2018, but he's back in the run again, and he is inside the margin of error at this point, trailing by fewer than 4 points.
Yeah, right now that race would have to be classified as close to a toss-up with just a slight advantage to Gary Peters right now. It's not unexpected for a first-term U.S. senator to face this kind of a race.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's a shock to see Gary Peters in this position. Both of these candidates have a lot of room to move, but I think this race gets caught up in whatever the national tide is going to be.
And there's going to be an outrageous amount of money, I'm assuming, spent in that race.
I think everybody in Michigan needs to be ready for the ads.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, let's talk about Governor Whitmer. Our last poll was done, as I mentioned, last summer. It was just after they had signed an agreement on no-fault insurance reform. So there have been, I guess, fewer wins to talk about since then, especially when it comes to the roads. And her job performance rating has dipped just a little bit among Michiganders.
Yeah, it has. Back in June, she had just come off auto insurance reform. She had a 50% approval rating. Now she's +7, down at 44%. It's a slight dip, but for a first-year governor, she's in a solid position. Nobody wildly dislikes her. Nobody wildly loves her. And I think that's expected. Her numbers are rather soft yet, and she's got plenty of time to kind of build her whatever her story is going to be. A
year in, still perhaps sort of undefined in the minds of many. Back now to whether Michigan goes blue or red this November. What do you think ends up deciding that question, Richard?
Well, you know, one of the interesting things we did in this survey that really caught my attention was we looked at people by whether they say they live in urban, suburban, rural, or small town areas. And the fight is right now in the small towns, where Donald Trump holds a narrow lead, but he's getting wiped away in the suburbs. The Trump campaign has got to do better in the suburbs. I think right now we're watching them try to secure their base in small towns. And this is really where the fight's going to be. But the bottom line on this is going to be, after the Democrats pick their nominee, does their motivation to vote continue at these levels?
Well, in fact, that's the engagement level here. You talked about how historic that is at the moment. I suppose that favors the Democrats if there is huge turnout, because we saw what happened to Hillary Clinton when turnout didn't answer the way that she expected and frankly, many watchers expected.
Well, Republicans are going to vote. They're going to vote whether they like their nominee or not, and it's going to be 2 to 2.3 million votes. History tells us that. But Democrats, if they're not motivated, they look like Hillary Clinton at 2.27 million. If they love their nominee and are excited, it looks more like 2.8 million, which Barack Obama.
Yeah. Richard, it is always fascinating to talk to you. I look forward to many more such conversations as we go through what we expect is going to be quite a year.
Great.
Yep, you bet. Richard Zuba from the Glenn Gariff Group, our pollster here for both the Local 4 and the Detroit News, and we'll dig more into these poll numbers. We'll bring in our roundtable right after this. This is Flashpoint on Local 4.
When Gardner White says the proof is in the prices, we mean it.
Take a look. The Uptown has a hardwood frame, steel springs, and 4 free designer pillows. The competition sells a look-alike for $1,000. At Gardner White, just $4.95 for on-trend style and made in the U.S. quality.
Is your house cold and drafty? Are your energy bills through the roof? With Michigan's winter being so unpredictable, you cannot afford not to insulate your home another winter. Stop bleeding money. Insulate your walls and attic. Cut your energy bill up to 50% with Ace & Sons.
More than 2.5 million Americans are addicted to opioids. The addiction is sometimes developed through the improper use of prescription painkillers. Using prescribed medication in ways or amounts not intended by a doctor is very dangerous. So it's important that unused prescriptions are properly disposed of. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, or for more information about prevention, treatment, and recovery services, or how to properly dispose of medication, contact the Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network, 24/7, 800-241-4949. Here to talk, here to help.
Before you book, you'll want to see this.
Don't freeze here when you can chill in Florida. Ultra-low fares on Allegiant to Sarasota, Fort Lauderdale, and 3 more Florida cities.
Flint Bishop Airport. Not the only way to fly, just a better one.
Smart shoppers, this is the moment you've waited for. Introducing Gardner White's greatest clearance sale of the decade. Take an extra 20% off everything you've ever wanted, and we pay your tax on top of that. Don't be fooled by so-called sales. Sunday and Monday is your time to save.
The defenders get results.
A certain type of guardrail that could be a potentially deadly hazard.
A guardrail pierced her car and she was killed instantly.
Defender Karen Drew first exposed the problem.
Defenders have learned these guardrails are used in the state, most of them right here in Metro Detroit.
And other states have had issues.
And the state decided to take action.
Crews out making repairs to local guardrails.
The local Ford defenders know how to get results.
Because your moments matter.
Need something investigated? Contact the defenders.
Well, we've looked at the results, our snapshot of Michigan in early January. Let's talk about that snapshot and what's ahead with our Roundtable. Political consultant Mario Morrow is back with us, and so is Jill Alper of Alper Strategies. Tori Sachs is the executive director of Michigan Rising Action. She directed John James' campaign back in 2018. We're going to talk about that race coming up. And our partner in this poll over at the Detroit News is their editorial page editor, Nolan Finley. Nolan, let me start with you. What was your biggest takeaway? Was there anything that jumped out at you from our findings?
I'm surprised that it was as close as it was, that Trump was as strong as he was at this stage against the Democratic field. Other than Joe Biden in the head-to-heads, I mean, he's doing fairly well considering the bad press he's received, if you will. I don't think he's any worse.
Just shows how cemented we all are into positions, though, doesn't it?
I don't
doesn't
know
seem to
that
matter what happens.
I don't know that he's any worse shape than he was at the start of the campaign in the fall of 2016. I think if you go back to those polls, he's about where he was against Hillary Clinton at Labor Day in that campaign. I mean, it tells me that Michigan's still very much in play.
I was surprised, Jill, to find that Michael Bloomberg was the second strongest candidate in this for a guy who has really barely started running. Actually, I shouldn't say barely started running. There are quite a few ads that are on right now, but hasn't really shown up here much yet. We don't really have him as a fixture in our mind, I didn't think yet.
Right, well, it just goes to show you the power in advertising, because you can get people to focus before they're ready to focus, but that I think also in Michael Bloomberg you have a compelling story that's a different story that would resonate in an electorate. People forget our primary is open too. So I think the poll did reflect a number of independent-minded, where the president's not doing so well, support for Michael Bloomberg. So we may see a lot of Republicans who aren't happy with Trump looking to see or to influence who the Democratic nominee is.
Be interesting. Mario, it's interesting. If you're a Democrat or you're supporting Democratic candidates and you look at a poll and a guy who's been impeached is only 7 points ahead of the strongest rival that you can present, that seems to suggest quite a challenge.
Quite disturbing to a lot of people, especially the Democrats. I agree with Nolan. I'm surprised that it's so close. And also, I'm surprised even on the senatorial side that James and Peters are as close as they are, even though the power of the dollar, and James has been raising a lot of money, and Peters has been outside the state raising money, but hasn't had that visibility. But yes, Democrats, I believe, are quite disturbed that it's as close as it is with all the problems and issues that Mr. Trump has had.
In fact, Tori, let's talk about the James race, which you're pretty familiar with that. I think what that, even though he lost to Debbie Stabenow, he seemed to show a certain degree of viability, I suppose, to a lot of national Republican movers and thinkers, and so they're more than happy to let him run again against a first-time or a rookie senator.
Sure. I remember last time John was a political nobody. He had never raised a dollar. He had never been in politics. He was a military veteran. He was a West Point grad. He was a successful business leader in Detroit. And to raise the money that he did against, in the primary, if you remember, it was a $10 million primary, and then going up against Senator Stabenow, who's been in office for 18 years, I think John did great. He built a huge, call it grassroots army of people who supported him last time that are supporting him even more this time. And these are small dollar donors in Michigan, across the state, and around the country. And that's what Mario said, he was raising money, and that's really who's fueling his fight right now.
Well, I mentioned to Richard the money that it takes to run a Senate campaign these days is...
Well, or a House campaign. You look at what Slotkin Bishop spent.
That's right.
I think in that race, what we're seeing in the poll is pretty much the partisan breakdown in Michigan. It pretty much reflects the number of percentage of Republicans, percentage of Democrats, very high undecided. It was 16, 17%, and that's where the fight's going to be. I think you substitute any Republican name, any Democratic name, you're going to get that same result as that poll showed.
Well, Jill, let me let you weigh in on what I mentioned to Mario. Is there a degree of frustration there that you've got a president who not only has been impeached, but a trade war that has been, I don't want to say uniquely harmful to Michigan, but it's certainly been felt here in maybe more profound ways than a lot of other places, and yet you really don't have a runaway candidate. Is that surprising to you, or is that just where we are?
No, not at this stage in the process. I mean, I think it's definitely deserves some inquiry, but at the same time, we know that the two sides are pretty hardened in their partisan ways. There always is a fight for that 10, 11, 12, 13% in the middle. There is not clarity. I was actually surprised, frankly, that all of the Democrats were ahead of Trump, albeit two of them in margin of error. So the feeling thermometer being up at 9.5% when there's turnout and an excited electorate, that means our Democrats are going to show up. We saw that in 2018. And so I think people are excited and focused. They like to talk about the issues and the differences, and that this impeachment thing may be somewhat or more behind us than it was a month ago, not sucking up all of the oxygen so that Democrats can do what they did in the 2018 election.
And Devin, I wouldn't make any assumptions about where Michigan voters stand on the trade issues. I was out to Macomb County Friday morning, and their take on this whole trade, particularly trade war with China, is, hey, somebody's standing up against people who have taken our jobs for decades. So,
but that's Macomb County.
Well, and that's a big county,
yeah,
and pretty indicative
Macomb
of
County
how
Democrats
Michigan goes, you know.
But we're watching 1,500 steel jobs going away. The agriculture sector has been it'll be years before the soybean market can recover.
Except in a lot of areas, a lot of places, agriculture receipts are up this year. I mean, across the Midwest. So again, I wouldn't read too much.
Subsidies?
No, I mean the subsidies certainly will help farmers, as we mentioned last week. But you know, I don't know that those folks. You keep hearing, well, folks. Trump's voters are voting against their own interests. I don't know that they see it that way.
Tori, I said on the program 2 weeks ago, it's a weird thing to say that I don't think that impeachment is an issue for voters, because the voters have already made up their minds. But isn't that's sort of how it feels right now, isn't it? I mean, it's not really, you're either in or you're not in.
I think what voters voted for in 2018 was the Democratic message of health care and prescription drugs. They got none of that. They've gotten 2 years of obstruction, 2 years of impeachment, 2 years of stopping things like the USMCA, which would help our manufacturing and our agriculture industry. And I think that's what voters are caring about. I think as we start to see Trump deliver that message in Michigan, he was here in Battle Creek, he's been in Toledo, I think the president's chances looks pretty good.
Is that fair?
I think people do want to see something get done, but at the same time, there are all kinds of bills coming out of the House that aren't being dispensed with in the Senate. And I think that there are issues
like all of them.
There of tone and a record and what kind of a president, you know, there are issues, and then there's who's sitting in the Oval Office. And you just have to think about this last week and what's happened abroad. People were frightened about and are frightened about what's happening in the world. And so I do think that while people want progress, they want a steady hand at the realm. At the helm, excuse me.
Mario, last before I got to get to a break, but that's where we remain. Everybody seems to be so cemented in position. Largely, it seems to me how you felt about what happened with the president's actions regarding Iraq and Iran have to do with whether you supported them in the first place.
And that's what
never seem to change.
And that's what makes Michigan so interesting and so important in the whole dynamics of this whole election process. It is a purple state. You mentioned that in your opening. And Richard talked about how it's split down the middle and how it's not all about metropolitan areas like Detroit, but it's going to be in those small areas, and not even the suburban areas, but those small towns, which I think is going to go back to something that you said, Nolan. And I think it is important on what has happened and what hasn't happened, because I think the farmers and those people who are actually on the ground doing that work are going to make the difference.
I got to get to a break. When we come back, I'll let Nolan respond to that and more. What will be the difference maker then as we head toward Election Day 2020? This is Flashpoint. Hello, before.
In 1949, Ford Motor Company created the Ford Motor Company Fund to help serve our communities. Whether here in Detroit or around the globe, we are making people's lives better through innovation and access. Our programs create new opportunities for today's youth and even build water systems in Thailand. It's about impacting one community through one program, one person at a time. Join us this holiday season as we gather with friends and family and celebrate the season of giving. From our team to yours,
Happy Holidays! Smart shoppers, this is the moment you've waited for. Introducing Gardner White's greatest mattress sale of the decade. Check out this Serta Perfect Sleeper with cool twist gel memory foam. The competition charges $9.99 for the mattress. Your price, $5.99, and the adjustable base is free. Save $400 and get a free power base upgrade. Snore less and sleep better. All for just $10 a month, interest free.
We will not be undersold on any mattress.
Don't overpay. Save. Sunday and Monday, only at Gardner White.
Did you know that nearly every client who's retained a Lea & Ponto has received a recovery? If you've been in an accident, you're probably asking yourself a lot of questions. Was I at fault? Do I deserve compensation? Who do I call?
And those are all great questions for your lawyer. Call your lawyers at Lea & Ponto, because the truth is, no one's going to tell you what you deserve better than us. Call 855-75-EP-LAW, because if you don't win, we don't win.
The local 4 defenders were the first to expose this toxic disaster. Now, Help Me Hank is fighting to find out why more wasn't done to stop it.
Somebody needs to be held responsible for the lack of work that was done.
And he won't quit until he gets answers. And that's not all. Defender Karen Drew takes on a different fight to keep uranium, lead, and more out of our river.
We know it's contaminated soil, and it's eroding into the river.
As these toxic threats develop, no Local 4 will stay on top of these stories. Monday on Local 4 News at 5.
All right, welcome back to Flashpoint. Before we were interrupted by the business we have to do around here, Nolan Finley, you wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, Richard Suba talked about the fight for suburban voters. If this economy keeps cooking like it's been cooking, adding jobs, adding income now for the first time really in a decade, stock market up now, you know, Friday it topped 29,000 before it fell back a little. People are going to look at that. And when you talk about voting your interests, they're going to say, well, I don't know how much, and a lot of it obviously depends on who the Democrat is, but am I going to trust this economy to someone who says we want to tear everything up? And I think that'll be a factor in Trump's favor if it continues.
Or it's the economy, stupid. Is it just that simple? Always boils down to that?
It is, and I think Donald Trump has been fighting for the economy. I think the other part of that poll was that all the Democrats are underwater. All of their unfave is higher than their fave, and they still have room to grow. So I think as voters start to see that the Democrats want to take away their insurance with Medicare for all, that means if you have Blue Cross through your employer, you will lose your health insurance under Bernie Sanders' plan. And I think as voters start to learn that, I think they'll come back to Trump and the Republican Party.
I think we have to see who the nominee is, and given this sort of stronger economy, people would argue that a lot of that happened or started to happen under Obama's watch. But aside from that, is that why is it that only 1/3 of the people are in this poll prepared to vote for the president? A, and then B, why are 51% saying they'd be willing to consider someone else?
But because it's still, you know, it is an economic, all elections sort of boil down to economics, I think, except maybe this one where character is, and we've talked about that all year, character is at the forefront. But you mentioned Obama. If you look at the Democratic field, even if you give credit to Obama for this economic surge, you look at the Democratic field, very few Obama-like candidates there to choose from for these Democratic voters.
Well, I would say that, you know, I know we're talking about the economy and how well it's going and the direction it's going, but character is an issue.
It is.
And behind the scenes, some of the finest Republican friends I have talk about how disappointed they are in this president and all the missteps that he's made, all the problems that are.
That's no
you weigh these imperfections and these problems and these characteristic issues over. Okay, but we don't know if he's stable or not. But the economy's good.
You're looking at your IRA, your 401k account, and you're saying, how much am I willing to risk that? The one thing I would
a man who's got his finger on the button, but who's willing to start a war.
Who has proved this week that he's going to keep Americans safe when they're killed in Iran.
Yeah, Iran worked out fairly well for him so far. But if we look at polling, and one thing I would caution about polling is still a lot of people out there who aren't willing to say, yeah, I'm
one
for
way or
Trump.
the other, yes.
And not
yes.
will not say that to pollsters, will not say that to anyone. You still get a lot of people who whisper, yeah, I like Trump, and aren't very vocal about it. I would count that in 2 or 3 points at least in any poll I read.
Jill, Tori mentioned Bernie Sanders. I want to get back to the fact that he's not doing as well in the poll as he was in the last poll, which was done this past summer. But the guy who won the Michigan primary, Michiganders were feeling the burn at the time. What explains that? Is it because of the other candidates? Is it the health problems that Bernie had to go through? What is going on there, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's a broader field. There's a wider variety of candidates who are involved who are eating certain portions up. Again, we have the open primary, so there may have been people who voted for him because they didn't like their other choices in the Republican primary, or they didn't support Secretary Clinton. Long story short, I think we want to learn from the past, but we want to look to the future. I don't underestimate Bernie Sanders and that his support is hard, and that the money he raises, it will continue to cascade. So I think that he'll be a factor. But back to something that Nolan said, which I appreciate, is that we do have, I think, a wide variety of candidates, and we cannot presume. A Biden or a Bloomberg candidacy probably looks far different than a Warren Sanders candidacy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would take issue with the fact that Republicans are going to vote in this primary. I don't think they are. Donald Trump is at 95% approval in the Republican Party. Republicans are happy. They're fired up to support him. I would say Joe Biden, who appears to be leading
Issue with the suggestion that Republicans might not turn out to vote, you mean?
No, issue that they might come in and vote in the Democratic presidential primary. I don't think they will. Republican approval rating for Donald Trump is at 95% right now.
But that's Republican approval rating. We have an open primary, and I think in the gubernatorial elections, for instance, whether it be Whitmer or it be Granholm, there were hundreds of thousands of crossover votes in those elections.
I got to leave it there. Gang, thanks very much for the great conversation. Great to have you all here. Thank you for being here as well. Meet the Press coming up next, right after Mitch Albom's Heart of Detroit, and I hope we'll see you right back here next Sunday for Flashpoint.